Good day, everyone. Welcome to our discussion for today. I, Genesis Umamil, along with Sean Luis Oliveros, will introduce you to one of David Hume's books titled An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. But first, let us know who is David Hume.
David Hume was born on May 7, 1711, in Edinburgh, Scotland. Hume was a Scottish philosopher, historian, economist, and essayist, known especially for his philosophical works in empiricism and skepticism. He took the scientific method of Sir Isaac Newton as his model and built on the epistemology of John Locke. Hume tried describing how the mind works in acquiring what is called knowledge, and concluded that no theory of reality is possible, that there can be no knowledge of anything beyond experience. David Hume was born to a moderately wealthy family from Berwickshire. His father died just after his second birthday, which left him and his siblings in the care of their mother. Hume went to the University of Edinburgh at the age of 11 and eventually left when he was 15 to pursue his education privately. He was initially encouraged to consider a career in law, but his interests soon turned to philosophy. And during these years of private study, he began raising serious questions about religion. Some years later, when he was residing in France, David Hume composed his three-volume treatise of human nature, which explored several philosophical topics such as space, time, causality, external objects, the passions, free will, and morality, offering often original and skeptical appraisals of these notions. Although scholars today recognize it as a philosophical masterpiece, Hume was disappointed with the minimal interest in his book. In 1741 and 1742, Hume published his two-volume piece, Essays, Moral and Political, which were written in a popular style and were more successful than the treatise. He then became a candidate for the chair of moral philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. But with his anti-religious writings from his work The Treatise, many critics from the university opposed him and he eventually withdrew his candidacy. Hume was convinced that the poor reception of his treatise was caused by its style rather than by its content. So, in 1748, he published his book, Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which was a more popular rendition of portions of Book 1 of the treatise. In 1751, he published his Enquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, which recasts parts of Book 3 of the treatise in a very different form. The work establishes a system of morality upon utility and human sentiments alone, without the appeal to the divine moral commands. And by the end of the century, Hume was recognized as the founder of moral theory of utility and was acknowledged by the utilitarian political theorist Jeremy Bentham. The same year, Hume also published his Political Discourses, which drew immediate praise and influenced economic thinkers such as Adam Smith, William Godwin, and Thomas Malthus. Around this time, Hume also wrote his two most substantial works on religion, the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion and the Natural History of Religion. The Natural History appeared in 1757, but on the advice of his friends who wished to steer Hume away from religious controversy, the Dialogues remained unpublished until 3 years after his death, in 1779. In 1756, a volume of Hume's essay titled Five Dissertations was printed and ready for distribution. But the essays had to be altered because some of his paragraphs made direct attacks on common religious doctrines and were extremely offensive. The essays were then bound with the new title Four Dissertations and was distributed in January 1757. In the years following the Four Dissertations, Hume completed his last major literary work, The History of England, which gave him a reputation as a historian that equaled, if not overshadowed, his reputation as a philosopher. He returned to Edinburgh and continued developing relations with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, in 1766, was ordered out of Switzerland by the government in Bern. His remaining years in Edinburgh were spent refining his published works and socializing with friends in Edinburgh's intellectual circle. And lastly, in 1776, at age 65, Hume died from an internal disorder which has plagued him for many months.
So, we'll start the discussion in section 2 titled Of the Origins of Ideas. David Hume started section 2 saying that Everyone will readily allow that there is a considerable difference between the perceptions of the mind when a man feels the pain of excessive heat or the pleasure of moderate warmth, and when he afterwards recalls to his memory the sensation or anticipates it by his imagination. Here he differentiated the act of thinking from the actual experience of the sensation and feeling. Let's have an example. Let us say that your friend tells you that he's getting butterflies in his stomach. You would know exactly what he means, but it is not the same as feeling actual butterflies in his stomach. To further elaborate this, David Hume divided the perceptions of the human mind into two divisions. Let us start with impression. Impression is the sensations and feelings that we experience in a lively and forcible manner. By mentioning sensations, he meant by using our five senses: our sense of touch, taste, hearing, sight, and smell. And by feelings, he meant that our ability to feel emotions like love, hate, desire, or will. The other division is what we call ideas. To him, ideas are the less forcible and lively perception. It is a copy of impression in a fainter and duller sense. Hume stated, or to quote, in his book that impressions are distinguished from ideas, which are the less lively perceptions, of which we are conscious when we reflect on any of those sensations or movements above mentioned. And all our ideas are more feeble perceptions, are copies of our impressions or more lively ones. It means that all of the thinking is derived either from our outward or inward sentiment. Because we are able to have thoughts similar to impressions, we are able to create things in our minds that do not even exist, like monsters. After all, we know that the mind is powerful. Hume himself said that the thought of a man is unbounded and is not even restrained within the limits of nature and reality. Let's have the example given by Hume, which is the Golden Mountain. We cannot derive an impression of what an actual golden mountain is. Therefore, we would join two ideas that we are familiar with, which is the idea of a mountain and the idea of gold. The image created would be a mountain that has a color of gold. Hence, we created a new idea, which is the idea of a golden mountain. With this, Hume thinks that all our ideas, come from our own experience of feelings and sensations. He called it the copy principle. He came up with 2 points for this argument. To quote, when we analyze our thoughts or ideas, however compounded or sublime, we always find that they resolve themselves into such simple ideas as were copied from a precedent feeling or sentiment. Even those ideas, which at first view seem the most wide of this origin, upon a near scrutiny to be derived from it. So when we try to analyze our thoughts, no matter how complex it is, we can find that it is only a copy of our impression. To give an example, let's have the idea of God. Our idea of God being a wise and intelligent being is just a copy of our impression of what is goodness and wisdom. Another proof is to quote, if it happened from a defect of the organ, that a man is not susceptible of any species of sensation, we always find that he is a little susceptible of the correspondent ideas. When one has a problem on his organ, used to experience impressions, then he cannot form the corresponding ideas to it. To have an example for it, a blind man is not able to use his sense of sight. Then that would mean that he cannot form a notion of colors. It's the same scenario with a deaf person, except it is for his sense of hearing that is affected and his notion of sounds. So if we are not able to have an impression, then we cannot form ideas for it. But Hume gave an exception, and it is in the ideas of color. When a man can perfectly see different colors but cannot see a certain shade of blue, is he still able to have an idea of what the certain shade of blue is? Hume answered this and said, yes, he is able to have an idea with the help of the other shades of blue surrounding it and with the help of his imagination. But Hume said that this exemption case is rarely used. So we are done with section 2, let's tackle section 3. In section 3, titled Of the Association of Ideas, David Hume started it with, "It is evident that there is a principle of connection between the different thoughts or ideas of the mind, and that, in their appearance to the memory or imagination, they introduce each other with a certain degree of method and regularity." According to him, there are principles of connection between our thoughts and ideas. He listed 3 principles, and we will start discussing them. First is resemblance. Whenever we see a picture, it naturally leads our thoughts to the original. With the example given, which is an apple, a sketch of it allows us to think of a real apple. We are associating our ideas to the similarity. Our second principle is contiguity, the sequential occurrence causing their association in the mind. Let's say that you are in your apartment, and then you experience a power outage. You will associate in your mind that the other apartments in the building also experienced the power outage. Third and last is cause and effect. We are all familiar with this concept. It is when a certain event or the cause makes another event happen, which is the effect. A perfect example of this is the pain that a wound brings when a sword crosses and inflicts a wound on you. You would think that since a sword had been in contact with your skin, it would cause a wound, and because you have a wound, the pain enters. That is an example of cause and effect. As David Hume stated, all we can do in such cases is to run over several instances and examine carefully the principle which binds the different thoughts to each other, never stopping till we render the principle as general as possible. So this means that this does not close the possibility of the mixture of the different principles. All we have to do is examine carefully what binds the different thoughts together. So that concludes our section 3. Let's proceed to section 4. All the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into 2 kinds, to wit, relations of ideas and matters of fact. Hume started this section's part 1, categorizing the objects of human reason or inquiry into 2. The 2 kinds, as stated, are the relations of ideas and matters of fact. So let's discuss our first category, which is the relations of ideas. Propositions of this kind are discoverable by the mere operation of thought without dependence on what is anywhere existent in the universe. The relations of ideas, as stated above, are discoverable by the mere operation of thought. It is a certainty that cannot be false as it concerns the insight of the mind. It is a priori since it is learned independently of experience. And lastly, denial of it implies a contradiction. To give an example for this category, consider the statement, "All bachelors are unmarried men." The concept of unmarried men already contains the bachelors. The subject of the sentence, which is the bachelor, already includes everything the sentence said about the subject. Our second category, which is the matters of fact. Matters of fact, which are the second objects of human reason, are not ascertained in the same manner, nor is there evidence of their truth, however great, of a like nature with the foregoing. Matters of fact is completely the opposite of relations of ideas. It does not deal with the operation of thought, but deals with actual experience. The certainty of it does not reach 100%, a posteriori because it is learned from experience, and lastly, denial of it does not mean a contradiction. So for this category, let's give an example. The sun will rise and set tomorrow. There is no doubt that these events will happen, but we are also not 100% sure if the sun will go out tomorrow. My knowledge that the sun will rise tomorrow is inferred from the past experience, which tells me that the sun has risen every day in the past. So, that concludes our part 1. Let us continue to part 2. Hume said that all reasonings concerning matter of fact seem to be founded on the relation of cause and effect. He is implying that the matters of fact are from sensory experience or memory. We know matters of fact about unobserved things through the process of cause and effect. Let us have an example once again. Let's have the example where a man finding a watch or any other machine in a desert island would conclude that there had been once men in that island. The reason why he would conclude that is because there have been previous people or men on the island, because a watch can only belong to a person, though this cannot be 100% certain. So, how do we know that the principle of cause and effect exists? Hume's answer is a bit disconcerting, for we cannot discover the relation between causes and effects by reason, but by only experience. He argues that there is no other possible way to answer curiosity but by experience. The question, then, is how we can ground general principles that we learn from experience. Hume's answer to that is the concept of inductive reasoning or induction. Induction essentially consists in observing and predicting the future based on what we have observed in the past. Our example for this is about bread. The bread that I ate yesterday nourished me. Therefore, it will also nourish me tonight. How can I know that bread will nourish me tonight? Because simply, to answer this, I have eaten the same thing yesterday, and I experienced that it nourished me, so I can expect that it will also nourish me tonight. However, Hume says that we cannot be fully certain about that knowledge. Hence, there is a problem on induction. There are possibilities that things will not turn out like what we expect, based on what we experienced from the past. Let me pass the spotlight to Sean for our remaining sections.
And now moving on to part 1 of section 5, entitled Skeptical Solution of These Doubts. Hume acknowledges that skepticism could never undermine our reasoning from common life. Nature always wins out against abstract reasoning. However, he does claim to have shown that there is a step in our reasoning from experience that is not supported by any argument or process of understanding. There is no solid reason why we should reason according to cause and effect, and yet we never fail to do so. In this section, Hume attempts to answer the question, how does one start formulating the ideas of causation? Hume reasons that in a scenario where someone is thrown into the world with no prior experiences, they would observe regular successions of events but would have no understanding of the processes of cause and effect. Life would then be an intelligible string of unconnected events, but after the person's been around and for a while and gained more experience, they will begin to draw inferences. He will infer a certain event from the presence of another event because over time he has observed constant conjunctions from these events. According to Hume, we cannot sense causation, nor as he argued in the previous section, is it present in our reasoning. Hume's answer then is that our reasoning from experience derives from customs or habits as opposed to understanding or reason. In Hume's own words, all inferences from experience are effects of custom and not of reasoning. We behave in a specific way not because of reasoning, but because we have behaved or thought the same way in the past. And that it's simply just a natural feature about humans, a natural instinct, that we come to conclusions this way. It is every bit as unavoidable as feeling love or hatred. Now, without customs, Hume remarks, reasoning that concerns matters of fact could not extend beyond our memories and present experiences. We could not speculate nor even act if custom had not been implanted in us if it had not implanted in us the ability to see certain actions having certain consequences. Nonetheless, Hume points out that all reasoning from experience ultimately falls back to simple impressions. What I know about past ages might come from reading a history book, or what I speculate about the future might ultimately fall back upon observations I am making in the present. Therefore, our speculations about unobserved matters of fact rest upon a constant conjunction within our present impressions. Now, this descriptive account does not, Hume think, render the idea of causation useless. Indeed, quite the contrary is the case. Being able to connect experiences by way of principle, by way of the principle of custom, is essential for navigating life. What Hume wants to make clear is that this principle yields belief instead of knowledge. In part 2 of section 5, Hume analyzes the nature of belief. Hume suggests that we make inferences by means of the imagination, but draws a careful distinction between fiction and belief. He begins by pointing out again that human imagination or fiction come up with various complex ideas by modifying and compounding simple ideas. Fiction is the product of pure imagination, conjuring up all sorts of strange images derived from our simple impressions. Examples of such are unicorns, alien civilizations, etc. Now, what differentiates fiction from beliefs is that belief is a combination of imagination and a certain sentiment that we cannot control. That suggests to us that our imaginings or imaginations correspond with reality. Beliefs have a different feeling attached to them, a feeling that gives them more weight and influence, makes them appear of greater importance, enforces them in the mind, and renders them the governing principle of our actions. When some memory or sense of impression is present in our minds, the force of custom will then carry the imagination to think of something else that impression is constantly conjoined to. Now, this force of custom forms our beliefs and creates a more vivid, forceful, and firm version of our imaginations. Though concerning the matter of conceiving the formation of a belief is non-rational, it is not under one's control. The feeling of belief is not willed by simply a natural state. In other words, this disposition is itself brought about by belief, the memories, the belief triggers, and custom, which is what makes us draw inductive inferences. So we can see that for Hume, custom or habit is of crucial importance, not something to be dismissed because it's not a form of reason. Custom is necessary to the subsistence of our species and the regulation of our conduct in every circumstance and occurrence of human life. Cause and effect, like the other two laws of association discussed in section 3, allows the mind to move from one thought to another. When these laws of association are led by custom, they form very strong instinctive beliefs. Hume remarks that it is better if our knowledge of causation is formed by instinct rather than by reason. The instincts enforced by custom are far less susceptible to error and are thus a far stronger means of securing our ideas of cause and effect. Now, moving on to part 1 of section 7 of the idea of necessary connection, Hume is trying to prove that there is no knowledge of cause and effect relations, only belief. The intensity of belief is proportional to the frequency of the observed events claimed to be causally related. However, this belief is not derived from a sense of impression of that connection. Hume reminds us about this theory of simple and complex ideas. Simple ideas are copies of impressions. Complex ideas arise out of modifying and compounding these simple ideas, which are vivid, sensible, and unambiguous. For a complex idea like causation to have any meaning, we must be able to trace it from the simple impression from where it was derived from. Hume points out that all our ideas related to cause and effect, such as power, force, and necessary connection, are all extremely obscure. So he wants to try to figure out what they are and where they come from. Do our ideas of power or necessity arise from experience? He argues that we don't actually perceive power or necessary connection. We observe, for example, a billiard ball moving after being struck by another billiard ball, or that whenever there's fire, there's heat. Our senses don't actually grasp the causal connection between one billiard ball and the next, or between fire and heat. So, he therefore concludes that there is no external impression that generates the idea of power or necessary connection. Okay, then maybe there's an internal impression that does. Perhaps it could be argued that whenever we voluntarily move parts of our body, we feel this power, and that's where the idea comes from. Well, Hume argues that this isn't actually what's going on. We will a certain part of our body to move, and this is followed by that part of our body moving. A person cannot perceive the power or force that voluntarily moves a limb any more than one involuntarily breathes or his heart beats. We don't actually encounter any power or necessary connections here, just a succession of acts, the willing and the moving. Besides, a close study of anatomy reveals that there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens between the willing and the final effect that we have no knowledge of. So, it doesn't actually make sense to say that we're aware of the connection between the willing and the acting. The will is claimed to be the cause of human action, but such claims are less plausible than natural events, since claims on natural events can at least be observed. Okay, we don't encounter powers in cases where the mind tries to command the body. Maybe we do when we bring certain ideas into our mind, or decide to turn our inner attention to certain ideas. But again, Hume argues that what happens here is similar to what happens in the case of the moving parts in our body. We experience the desire or will to focus on a certain idea, and then we find ourselves focusing on that idea. We still don't encounter the supposed power that connects the first event and the second. So, we're still left with the fact that we only perceive conjunctions between two objects or events and not connections. No causal connection can be observed, let alone a necessary one. Therefore, without observation, it is not legitimate to claim that one event can contain an effect. Hume claims that perhaps there is something still more minute and unknown in these events that we still do not know about. Hume then concludes that the idea of power or necessary connection is not derived from a sense impression. Hume now points out that some philosophers, as a result, have adopted occasionalism. According to occasionalism, the powers are not in objects but in God. God wills all the conjunctions we observe. Hume's response to that is that it doesn't really solve the problem. It is true that we don't understand the power that determines how bodies operate on each other, but we are also equally ignorant of how a mind, even a supreme one, could operate on bodies. And the power of minds to act on bodies is, as we've already shown earlier, not something we have an impression of. Having rejected these explanations we've considered so far, Hume proposes his own solution. So, in part 2 of the section, Hume proceeds to argue that powers or connections are not things we observe, internally or externally. What we observe are regular successions of events. But we also showed in section 5 that as a result of custom, we always form certain expectations. Every time we see one billiard ball strike another, we see the second billiard ball move. And so, the next time we see it, we expect it to move. That is, the connection between the ideas is not something that is impressed on us by the world. It is something that is felt by the mind. We project this felt connection onto the world, which is why we think there are necessary connections between objects and events. And this is why Hume considered it necessary to offer his own revisionary definitions of cause and effect. Number 1, an object followed by another, and where all the objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. And number 2, an object followed by another, and whose appearance always conveys the thought to that other. Ultimately, David Hume concludes that we have no good reason to believe almost everything we believe in this world. But that is not such a bad thing. Nature helps us to get by where reason lets us down. Hume is unquestionably an empiricist philosopher, and he strives to bring the rigor of scientific methodology to bear on philosophical reasoning. His distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact is absolutely crucial in this respect. Anything we can say about the world is a matter of fact, and thus can be justified only through the experience, and can be denied without contradiction. Relations of ideas can teach us about mathematical truths, but it cannot, as some rationalist philosophers would have, teach us about the existence of ourselves, an external world, or even God for that matter. If we are left with only matters of fact to get us by in the world, we will find ourselves greatly limited. How can past experiences teach me anything about the future? Even to infer without circularity that future experiences will resemble past experiences requires principles that cannot be grounded in just past experiences alone. And without that principle, our ability to reason according to cause and effect, and thus the greater part of our ability to reason with matters of fact, is sharply curtailed. Rather than conclude that we cannot know anything about future events or the external world, he concludes that we are simply not rationally justified in believing the things we do. Hume does not deny that we make certain inferences based on causal reasoning, and indeed insists that we would be unable to live if we didn't do so. His point is simply that we are mistaken if we think that these inferences are in any way justified by reason. That is, there are no grounds for certainty or proof of these inferences. Hume is a naturalist because he suggests that nature, and not reason, leads us to believe the things we do. Habit has taught us that we are safe in making certain inferences and believing certain things, and so we don't normally worry about them too much. We cannot prove that there is a world external to our senses, but it seems to be a relatively safe assumption by which to live. Rather than to try to justify our beliefs or identify the truths, Hume seeks simply to explain why we believe what we believe. The Enquiry is decidedly a book about epistemology and not about metaphysics. That is, Hume is concerned about what and how we know, and not at all about what is actually the case. For instance, he does not deal with the question of whether there actually are necessary connections between events. He simply asserts that we cannot perceive them. Or perhaps more accurately, Hume argues that because we cannot perceive necessary connections between events, the question of whether or not they actually exist is just irrelevant and meaningless. And okay, that concludes our video report for Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Here are our references, and thank you for listening.